Hi there, my name is Reynolds Jones. I'm your instructor for this course as we introduce the history of Goddess theology. I was originally ordained as a Christian minister within a Pentecostal tradition, which went utterly insane almost immediately after I was ordained. The pastor under whom I functioned was excommunicate. I left. I retained my ordination. Many years I attended the Episcopal Church, never regularized there, and eventually I discovered Goddess theology. I discovered the idea of the divine feminine, and I pursued that idea. I have been a faculty member at the State University of New York for over 20 years. I've been tenured for over a dozen of those years. I have my tenure is in a professional title, but I have consistently held teaching responsibilities as well as professional responsibilities since the time I was tenured, without break. So I am used to teaching. My degrees, my advanced degrees, are technology related. And my commitment in this course is to see that you sort out what you believe, that you figure out what you hope for in the future, and that you learn something about the ancient history of our faith, because our faith, through its many iterations and permutations, has been around at least 25,000 years, and probably longer. Enjoy! Most modern Wiccans and neo-pagans worship the goddess as a trifold entity, a holy feminine trinity of maid, mother, and crone. Historically, this was not always true. Historically, there were maid goddesses, mother goddesses, and crone goddesses, and sometimes you saw goddesses move from one to the other, but not always. Inanna, for example, clearly starts as a maid goddess and becomes a mother goddess, but we never see her progress to a crone goddess, because the crone goddess within the Sumerian mythos was Ninharshak, who was the mother of everything. On the other hand, Inanna herself was referred to by a priest in a tablet scribed close to 3000 BC as the mother of all the gods. So she clearly was a mother, but not a crone. She never advanced to the grandmother, to the wise old woman stage. How we view each of these varies according to the particular pagan tradition in which we find ourselves and according to our own personal preference. And that is what we're going to discuss: the historic ancient goddesses and the views that we have today, and which ones they most clearly follow. Long before we began to have writing, the goddess was already present. The Venus of Willendorf is not even challenged as a goddess figurine, and it's 25,000 years old, which is the basis for one of the claims I make, that the worship of the goddess is at least 25,000 years old. In digs such as Catalhoyuk, many female figurines have been found. Some would prefer to argue that they're not goddesses, but there are no equivalent male figures, and it is very difficult to imagine that figures so similar to the Venus of Willendorf would not be divine as well. The preliterate is the term I'm using for these goddess figurines. The preliterate goddess was often depicted pregnant or even in the midst of delivery. She was clearly a nurturer and also a ruler. This is not surprising, given that we have significant anthropological evidence that societies were either egalitarian or even matriarchal prior to the arising of agriculture. She was a nurturer, she was a ruler, probably in the sense of a guide, but she was not viewed, we think, as being terribly special beyond that. Within Sumeria, the first of the surviving major high civilizations, we cannot deny, of course, the possibility that the Harappan civilization, which we're now discovering was much more extensive than we thought, may have been older than Sumeria. But, based strictly on Sumeria, the mother goddess and the maid goddess was Inanna. The crone goddess was Ninharsag. Inanna guaranteed fertility. She had prostitutes, both male and female, available to males, interestingly. All of her male priests were homosexual. She guaranteed fertility, grain. She was the goddess of grain. And she brought knowledge to humanity. She moved on to become Astarte and a dozen other Middle Eastern goddesses. And then she disappears from the record entirely. In Egypt, Isis became the intermediary, taking on some of Inanna's characteristics. She also became a virgin mother, having married Osiris before he was captured during the Pyramid Wars, so-called, and cut up, which resulted in her restoring him, which is how he went from being a god of life to a god of death, but being unable to ever find his penis. Therefore, Horus was essentially a virgin birth. Subsequently, the Temple of Isis survived long after any other Egyptian temple, and probably was the most powerful faith within Egypt, looked at from a henotheistic point of view. Her final temple, Philae, was destroyed in 535 at the order of the Emperor Justinian, so that the gold statues might be taken by the Christian Church and melted down. But the cult of Isis, the following of Isis, continued, and probably continued to endure to this very day, in its original form, as well as in its neo-pagan form. So today, there is a multiplicity of views of the divine feminine. We have some historic understanding of the various forms that the goddess took. We have some understanding of the theologies that developed and how those theologies influenced later theologies, including Christianity. We have considerable understanding of how one developed into the next, and we know that the very idea of goddess worship remains very threatening to a certain subsection of males within the patriarchal system, which we all have grown up in and are in a way part of. But we are worshippers of the divine feminine. This does not mean we do not acknowledge the divine masculine, nor that we do not worship the divine masculine. It means simply that we also worship, or primarily worship, the divine feminine. Which form of the divine feminine matters for you and for your individual walk in faith, for the purpose for which you get your ordination, for the purpose for which you seek this degree. There are dozens of ways of looking at the goddess, of looking at neo-paganism, of looking at Wicca. There's Dianetic witchcraft. which is not related to L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics, which is a different spelling, although the pronunciation sounds similar. There is a modern temple of Isis, which may or may not resemble the ancient one. There are a dozen other methods of looking at the divine feminine, and there are any number of holy symbols representing the different views, ranging from the axe to the figure of the Earth Mother, which represents the pre-literate goddess, to the pentagram, which is the symbol of Inanna, to the Ankh, the symbol of life in ancient Egypt, which was also primarily the symbol of Isis. And each path is a little bit different. Are you a nurturer, like the pre-literate? Are you a maid who wants to see things grow and prosper, like Inanna? Are you a ruler who is the queen of heaven and earth? Or do you view that as the way of the goddess, as was Isis? Are you a mother? Are you a maid? Are you a crone? What do you aspire to be? Where will your life take you? These are things that you must consider, and if you have not chosen a specific path within the pagan traditions at this point in your education, I want you to seriously consider one, and I want to see direct discussion between you and a paper of 2 to 4 pages explaining the particular path you think you're following.